Hello, good morning, and happy New Year's Eve, December the 31st, 2020. And Republican Josh Hawley has filed an election challenge in which he will join certain Republicans of the U.S. House of Representatives, even though, of course, they know who will lose. Because all of the Democrats will, of course, vote on January the 6th, 2021 to ratify the US President-elect Joe Biden's election victory. So will enough Republicans, including the US Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, so that this will be so much hot air, so much jazz, and so much posturing, designed to please those die-hard Republicans and then people in the far right, populist right, the national, who claimed that the election was stolen from Joe Biden, despite the fact that one recount after another has already recertified and ratified his victory, despite the fact that when the Electoral College met on December the 14th, 2020, in other words, about 2.5 weeks ago, not a single one of the 538 presidential electors deviated from the presidential elections results in his or her home state. As expected, 232 presidential electors voted for Donald Trump, and the remaining 306 presidential electors voted for Joe Biden. Donald Trump had already promised to abide by the presidential electors' decision, but yet he has wanted to please his hardcore supporters by continuing to insist that he actually won. Senator Hawley, in his baseless election challenge, claims that the legitimate concerns of people need to be heard, as if the Trump campaign hadn't already filed 60 election challenges during the last several weeks. Surely the legitimate, those people who claim that Donald Trump supposedly won the recent US presidential elections have already. So this is, but of course, this is something that the defeated and outgoing US President Donald Trump, in order to nurse his wounded and oversized ego, likes to hear. And it's very tragic that Hawley, who is in his heart that Donald Trump lost, the election's free and fair, he still cater to the populist right, to the far right, and unchecked Republicans and Republicans who honorably have presidential elections, and that those presidential elections were, despite the pandemic and despite the nasty partisan rhetoric on both sides of the political spectrum in the United States, free and fair. So let's look at, once again, the facts. First of all, a record number of voters cast votes, almost 160 million votes. The preliminary voter turnout was 66.7%, the highest since 1900. And back in 1900, most US women who were US citizens could not vote. Neither could most African Americans vote. Some 81,269,000 US citizens voted for him, or 51.3%. The incumbent US President Donald Trump earned the dubious distinction of receiving the largest number ever of votes for a defeated presidential candidate, about 74,217,000. His popular vote total amounted to 46.9% of the votes. The United States was largely split in two parts. Joe Biden prevailed in 25 federal states. Washington, D.C., which always votes for the Democratic presidential candidate anyway, or has voted ever since second There are always a number of minor candidates in the presidential elections. Joe Jorgensen of the Libertarian Party was the most popular of them, getting 1.2% of the vote, while Howie Hawkins of the Green Party got 0.3% of the votes, and the others, including an African-American rapper, Kanye West, got the remaining, or between them, the remaining 0.4% of the votes. So with respect, I disagree with you, US President Mike. They have been counted already. There have been multiple recounts, and all of them have confirmed Joe Biden's victory. As usually, the winning candidate was overrepresented in the electoral vote. Biden got 51.3% of the popular vote and 56.9% of the electoral vote, while Donald Trump got 46.9% of the popular vote and 43.1% of the electoral vote. With respect to those who claim that Donald Trump won, I can understand their viewpoint because so many of them are so passionate supporters of Donald Trump. Donald Trump, why his character is such a figure that either he is admired or at least commended, or then he's criticized on people like individuals like him. Yes, it is true Pennsylvania went to Biden. However, in all of those states, there have been recounts, including 2 statewide recounts in Georgia, and all of those recounts have confirmed Biden's victory. So Biden was able to carry, in addition to Nebraska, the following US: Connecticut, Delaware, Georgia, Hawaii, Illinois, Maine, including Maine's 1st congressional district, Maryland, Massachusetts, Michigan, Minnesota, Nevada, New Hampshire, New Jersey, New Mexico, New York, Oregon, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Vermont, Virginia, Washington, Wisconsin. By contrast, Trump was able to carry, in addition to Maine's 2nd congressional district and Nebraska's 1st and 3rd congressional districts, the following US federal states: Alabama, Alaska, Arkansas, Florida, Idaho, Indiana, Iowa, Kansas, Kentucky, Louisiana. Hawley represents in the US Senate. I'm sorry, not Mississippi, but Missouri, the next one. Mississippi, Missouri, Montana, Nebraska, North Carolina, North Dakota, Ohio, Oklahoma, South Carolina, South Dakota, Tennessee, Texas, Utah, West Virginia, and Wyoming. So in the Electoral College, states, so including all 3 of the extremely close states where the victory margin was under 1%: Georgia, Arizona, and Wisconsin, for a total of 37 electors. He also was able to win 3 of the 5 notably close states where the margin of victory was between 1% and 5%: Pennsylvania, Nevada, and Michigan, while Trump was able to win North Carolina and Florida. Interestingly enough, the Biden campaign did not file a single lawsuit against the Trump campaign for those close states that Trump was able to win, at least not as far as I know, and I've been following these election results quite closely. And then finally, out of the 6 states that were fairly close, in other words, the victory margin was between 5% and 10%. Out of those 6 states, Biden was still able to win 3: Minnesota, New Hampshire, while Trump prevailed in Texas, Ohio, and Iowa. And so altogether, the close states netted Biden, if we ignore the electoral districts, the extremely close states, all the 37 electoral votes from them. Then the notably close states between 1% and 5% victory margins, Biden got 42 electors from them. And then Biden was able to get an additional 6 electors from the fairly close states. And then to this total, we should add his fairly narrow victory in Nebraska's 2nd congressional district. As for Trump, in the extremely close states, he did not get a single elector, not even a faithless one. In the fairly close states, between 1% and 5% victory margin, he was able to get 44 electors. And then in the notably close states, and then in the fairly close states, between 5% and 10% victory margin, he was able to get a total of 62 electors. In addition, he won Maine's 2nd congressional district. So in terms of the states, there were a total of 14 states that were either extremely close, 3 of them, notably close, 5 of them, fairly close, 6 of them. The other 36 states were then won by more lopsided margins, either by Biden or Trump. In other words, margins of over 10%. So in the future, in order to prevent these drawn out and exhausting and ultimately self-defeating election challenges, the United States should very seriously consider 2 constitutional amendments. One that would make sense would be to standardize the election rules so that they would be exactly the same in all the 50 federal states, and if possible, even in the several special territories and districts of the United States. Another one that the United States should seriously consider would be to abolish the Electoral College so that the popular vote would prevail. I don't know if there is enough political will in the US Congress or in 38 of the 50 US state legislatures to at least standardize the election rules. This would automatically eliminate the grounds for a great majority, at least something like 80 to 90% of these frivolous and useless, time and money consuming and democracy weakening election challenges. So let's go on still. Trump and a variety of his surrogates, in other words, assistants and supporters, made a series of false claims that the election was fraudulent. In other words, the so-called legitimate concerns of people have already been heard. And given the fact Trump's campaign has from citizens, Senator Hawley is simply being redundant to claim that there still needs to be a debate on the alleged election fraud. If there had been massive vote fraud, as Trump in that 46-minute post-election rant video claimed that tens of millions of ballots were counted falsely, then sure, there would have been many sober-minded and civic-minded and truth-loving and truth-telling uh, observers, American international ones, who would have objected to the election results and would instead have published detailed reports about the proven and provable cases of vote fraud. In other words, if Trump was right, then surely he was backed by many people who had no personal or partisan interests in these presidential elections, who only wanted the truth to prevail. For example, in the 1960 US presidential elections, so 60 years ago, there was much more evidence of vote fraud, and probably had those elections been totally free and fair, the official loser, Richard Nixon, who was then the US vice president and Republican presidential candidate, would have won. But he decided wisely to save himself for future presidential, and he to quietly concede those presidential elections. Instead of claiming that he had actually won, moved on with his temporarily retired after a qualified lawyer, and he prepared himself quietly for future presidential runs. And indeed, he managed to win two free and fair elections in 1968 and 1974. 1972, even though he was forced to resign because of the Watergate scandal and his deep involvement in it in 1974. Hillary Clinton could have challenged the election results in 2016, but she wisely chose. So could Mitt Romney in 2012, but he wisely decided not to. Theoretically, so could the late US Senator John McCain in 2008, but he decided not to. So could then US Senator for Massachusetts John Kerry in 2004, but he chose not to. Results back in 2000. However, Gore and those Gore has decided never to be a presidential candidate again because his decision to challenge those election results 20 years ago would automatically have become an election issue. And should soon to be former President Donald Trump insufficient, he's passionate enough to run for president in 2024. The Republican Party, if it wants to have a realistic chance of winning those elections, came up behind some liberal, moderate, centrist, or compassionately conservative presidential candidate who would prevail in enough primaries to deny Donald Trump his third presidential candidacy. Of course, he'll be a so-called spoiler. He could still run as a Democratic presidential, be whether Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, or someone else to win. So I'm from Wikipedia. So members of the United States Republican Party have reacted differently to the defeated President Donald Trump's. The more liberal, moderate, centrist, and moderately conservative members have said openly Biden has won and Trump has lost. Yeah, for several months before the US presidential elections even took place, Trump had been claiming that the only way he could lose his bid for re-election would be through vote fraud. And without citing any evidence, he claimed that the mail-in votes are much more susceptible to vote fraud than the votes which are cast in person. And he's so inconsistent and bizarre. On the one hand, he has claimed or demanded that every single legal vote be counted, and then on the other hand, some of his activists have asked judges to throw out millions of votes in those swing states, including a significant number of votes cast for Trump. So they are trying to have it both ways. Already on the afternoon of November the 4th, so the day after the official election day, the Trump campaign sued Michigan and Pennsylvania, alleging that they were not being given proper access by monitoring the vote counting process and demanded the counting had to stop. The Trump team already declared that supposedly the president had won the state of Pennsylvania at a moment when it was leading by 320,000 votes, but only 85% of the votes had been counted. And it was known that Al Schmidt, who oversaw the city's counting and was himself a Republican, rejected claims that the process lacked transparency, as observers were able to see everything that was happening in the counting hall. On November the 5th, 2020, President Trump made a speech in the White House alleging electoral fraud. However, Rick Santorum, former Pennsylvania and a former candidate for the U.S. Republican Party's presidential nomination, and then Senator Ben Sasse, Senator Mitt Romney, himself a former presidential candidate, then Governor Larry Hogan of Maryland, and former Governor Chris Christie of New Jersey were among the first Republicans to criticize President Trump's remarks as indefensible. Combined with a statement from former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, that some deemed to concede Trump's defeat. Nikki Haley also served as governor of South Carolina. Several Republicans, including Trump's adult sons Donald Trump Jr. and Eric Trump, rebuked other Republicans for staying silent and not supporting the president's allegations of electoral fraud. According to a Reuters Ipsos poll conducted on November the 5th, only about 30% of Americans identified most Republicans believed Biden had. Then on November the 6th, 2020, some Trump loyalists, such as Senators Lindsey Graham, Ted Cruz, Tom Cotton, and then Kevin McCarthy, who has served in the U.S., who is serving in the U.S. House of Representatives, endorsed the. On November the 7th, 2020, when most American news networks, the mainstream ones, the election victory for Biden, when vote counting in Pennsylvania and Nevada reached the point where he would certainly receive the minimum majority in the Electoral College, 270 electors needed to win the presidency, several Republicans congratulated Biden already, including Mitt Romney, Larry Hogan, John Kasich, Phil Scott, Adam Kinzinger, and Jeb Bush. Others, such as Senator Josh Hawley and then Paul Gosar, who is a U.S. representative for Arizona, insisted that the election was not over yet until all lawful votes had been counted, finished, and allegations of fraud addressed. Then, on November the 8th, 2020, former U.S. President George W. Bush congratulated Biden and Harris. On November the 9th, the Trump campaign announced legal challenges. On November the 10th, U.S. Secretary of State or federal Foreign Minister Mike Pompeo rejected Biden's victory, while other Republicans privately acknowledged it. On November the 11th, senior Republicans called on Trump to concede. On November the 12th, 2020, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, part of the US Department or Ministry of Homeland Security, published a statement calling these presidential elections the most secure ones in US history. Already on November the 3rd, Trump suffered legal setbacks. On November the 14th, he criticized Republican officials dismissing fraud. On November the 15th, there was confusion about partial concession. He tweeted a message which read, "He won," meaning Biden, "because the election was rigged," repeating a number of claims that have generally been dismissed as baseless. Then on November the 19th, the Biden-Harris transitional team hosted the bipartisan governor conference. Then there were legal developments from November the 19th to 22nd. Then finally, the General Services Administrator, Emily Murphy, formally ascertained Biden as apparent president-elect on November the 23rd. On December the 8th, 2020, during a meeting of the Joint Congressional Committee on Inaugural Democrats, a resolution affirming Joe Biden to be president-elect. The vote was 3-3 on party lines, so it failed. On December the 14th, the Electoral College met in the respective state capital. As expected, 300 voted for Biden, 232 voted for Trump. So not a single elector was faithless either. The following Republican officials have either explicitly publicly denounced the defeated President Donald Trump's election fraud claims, acknowledged Joe Biden as the US president-elect, or both. Federal executive officials, current US permanent representative to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, Kay Bailey Hutchison, who also has served as US Senator. Then Emily Murphy, the current Administrator of General Services, Stephen A. Schwartzman, advisor to President Trump. Then former ones, former US President George W. Bush, now former US Attorney General or Federal Justice Minister William Barr, former US Secretary of State, former US National Security Advisor and US Ambassador to the UN, US Secretary of Homeland Security Michael Chertoff, former US Defense Secretary, US Senator for Maine, and US Representative for Maine, National Intelligence Dan Coats, former White House Press Secretary Ari Fleischer, former US Senator for Nebraska and Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel, former Director of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency Christopher Krebs, former US Transportation Secretary and US Congressman or Representative for Illinois Ray LaHood, former Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs H. McMaster, former US Ambassador to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development Connie Morello, former Chief White House Ethics Lawyer Richard Painter, who in 2018 became an independent, former US Vice President Dan Quayle, former US National Security Advisor and Secretary of State or Foreign Minister Condoleezza Rice, former US Homeland Security Secretary, and before that, former Governor of Pennsylvania Tom Ridge, former White House Deputy Chief of Staff Karl Rove, and former Chief of Staff to the United Nations Secretary of Homeland Security Miles Taylor. And then the list goes on. Current Senators Lamar Alexander of Tennessee, Roy Blunt of Missouri, Bill Cassidy of Louisiana, Susan Collins of Maine, Johnny Ernst of Iowa, Deb Fisher of Nebraska, James Lankford of Oklahoma, Mitch McConnell of Kentucky, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, Rob Portman of Ohio, Mitt Romney of Utah, Marco Rubio, of Florida, Ben Sasse of Nebraska, Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania. In other words, this vote will be just meaningless because there are enough votes both in the U.S. House of Representatives and in the U.S. Senate to certify President-elect Joe Biden's and Vice President-elect Kamala Harris's victory. And then former Senators Bob Corker or Robert Corker of Tennessee, David Durenberger of Minnesota, Jeff Flake of Arizona, Bill Frist of Tennessee, Rick Santorum of Pennsylvania, Olympia Snowe of Maine. And then these U.S. representatives or so-called congressmen who are Republicans. Liz Cheney of Alabama, Liz Cheney of Wyoming, John Curtis of Utah, Jennifer Gonzalez of Puerto Rico, Will Hurd of Texas, John Katko of New York, Peter King of New York, Adam Kinzinger of Illinois, Paul Mitchell of Minnesota, Tom Reed of New York, Denver Riggleman of Virginia, Francis Mooney of Florida, Fred Upton of Minnesota, Don Young of Alaska. And then Representative-elect Mariannette Miller Meeks of Iowa. And significant number of former U.S. representatives. And federal judicial officials, current Stefanos Bibas, judge of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit. Matthew Brann, judge for the Middle U.S. District Court for the Middle District of Pennsylvania. Brett Ludwig, a judge on the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Wisconsin. Then such Republican governors as Charlie Baker of Massachusetts, Mike DeWine of Ohio, Doug Ducey of Arizona, Wanda Garced of Puerto Rico, Gary Herbert of Utah, Larry Hogan of Maryland, Asa Hutchinson of Arkansas, Kay Ivey of Alabama, Phil Scott of Vermont, Kevin Stitt of Oklahoma, Chris Sununu of New Hampshire, Ralph Torres of Northern Mariana Islands, and 4 former governors. And also several lieutenant governors have done the same, and a number of secretaries of state, 2 state senators, 2 state representatives, and so forth. So the case is basically dead. And there will be a meaningless vote that is, as Business Insider reports, all about putting U.S. Senator Hawley in the spotlight and, of course, pleasing Donald Trump so that he can position himself for Trump's campaign team should Trump ever again become a U.S. presidential candidate. Or if Trump doesn't, who knows, Senator Hawley might even position himself already in 2000. So the move will amount to a short delay in the certification of President-elect Joe Biden's victory in these presidential elections, but will not result in the results being overturned in any state. So clearly his concern is about pleasing himself, pleasing Trump, and pleasing Trump's diehard fans, not for the people. And meanwhile, people continue to get sick by the thousands, continue to die of America, and indeed on all the other countries. I wish you a happy, blessed, safe, encouraging, successful and healthy, fulfilling, and righteous New Year 2021.